Hello, everybody. We are back to talk about writing. And today we're going to be talking about antagonists, sometimes villains, sometimes not, people who get in the way of the people we really care about. So I know different members of our group have different, thoughts on this. So feel free, jump in, dive in. What do you want to say about this topic?
I would like to kick things off by saying there's a difference between a villain and an antagonist. I'm sure we all have different definitions. My definition is an antagonist who is someone who opposes the character. A villain is someone who tries to hurt your character. I recently started writing a story that I'm sharing in a college class right now, based on my mom's childhood. When my mom was 11 years old, her stepdad came home and said, "Guess what, family? I got a new job. We're moving to Iran." And she was chill with this. She's like, "Okay, so what? I'll live in the Middle East for the next 5 years. This is okay." And then 18 months into that, there was a revolution. She was evacuated as a refugee. And the leader of the revolution was a man named Ayatollah Khomeini. So I went into this book thinking, okay, Khomeini is the antagonist of the story because he's the reason the climax happens. He's the reason the book ends. He and my mom are never going to meet because my mom was an 11-year-old child and the protagonist who's based off her is a similar age. I share it with my creative writing class and they say, "Oh, so the stepdad is the villain because he's making this kid leave school, leave home, leave her country, leave behind this life she's known and go into the great unknown." And I hadn't thought about that before, but because of that, I then made moves to make the stepdad character, who was not my grandpa, just inspired by the life situation that my mother and my grandpa were in, to be more of an antagonist who's opposing the main character. So while a villain would want to hurt the character, like a dictator wants to hurt somebody he doesn't believe should be in his country, an antagonist is just doing things that are counter to your desires, like, "I want to stay in America and go to high school."
I think the distinction for me is actually between three different ideas. There's the idea of the villain whose motivations and actions are like morally or ethically questionable. And in some cases, the protagonist can agree with what they're doing because the protagonist is also morally evil. But the point is that it's not about what their actions are doing in relation to the protagonist. Whereas with antagonist, it is someone who is not necessarily morally wrong or ethically evil, but whose actions, for whatever reason, are actively barring the protagonist from achieving their goals. And then the third distinction is just with an obstacle. Like it doesn't even necessarily have to be an object. You'll find that most conflicts in sports movies and such arise from obstacles to be overcome rather than an active pushback from someone else. But an obstacle is just a person or thing that is in the way. Like it's not taking an action to do so. It is just sitting there doing its own thing and has to be overcome. So when we talk about antagonists, to me at least, I'm talking specifically about a person or thing whose actions are by definition stopping the protagonist from achieving their goals, whether it's intentional or not, or whether it's evil or not.
I think there's a couple of other interesting permutations you can take that on. The first is one that's been quite well explored over the last 10 years or so in genre fiction, which is the sympathetic villain, right? Where they've got their reasons and they're good reasons and they're justifiable within their own perspective, and given enough backstory and intelligence and charm that you want to be on their side, right? And you think Zuko and Avatar: The Last Airbender, which people hold up as sort of the ideal of the sympathetic villain. That can be super compelling if it's done right, although it's been done enough recently that I feel like some people are like, okay, you can just have some bad guys, that's okay. The thing that I really like to do is to find somebody whose actions are not opposed to the protagonist. They may even be on the protagonist's side, but they're just an a-hole. And you hate them, right? One of my books has a character like this, where this is a person this is one of the good guys, and she is the worst person to ever draw breath. Like she is horrible and mean and a molester and all sorts of awful things, right? And yet she ends up playing a pivotal role as the story progresses, because that's, I mean, you can have the good guys be bad guys, you can have the bad guys be good guys. Those are both fun coins to flip.
She really sucks. We don't like her.
Worst.
She really sucks.
I love her so much.
Yeah, kind of just to bounce off a little bit of what Cameron said, a quote that I hear particularly in film a lot of late is like, everyone is the hero of their own story, which is also a quote that I on some level have gotten tremendously tired of, just because of how frequently I've heard it bandied around. And I think that oftentimes it's true, right? But I do think that I'm in kind of the camp that you mentioned, Cameron, where it's kind of the group of people that are like, all right, we can do something else. I do think, I don't know, I've encountered a lot of people during the course of my life who I think see themselves as the villain of their own story. I think there are a lot more people that deal with self-loathing in our existence than maybe we give credit for. And so while they may think that they are the protagonist, maybe they think they're a villainous one, not a particularly heroic one. And I like reflecting that a little bit. Yep.
One of the, sorry,
Jeff.
go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this conversation about villains and these days everything is like the gray villain, or we're following the heroes, but they're really villains, but they're not villains. They're nice enough. I mean, there's a lot of that these days. Or if you meet a villain, you're going to get a backstory about the villain, so you feel more about him. I was watching sometimes old Kung Fu, and I don't even know what this Kung Fu movie is called, but it has a female villain who was just crazy. She was like absolutely insane. It was a movie from like the 70s. And I was like, this is refreshing. Like, I know there's none of me like siding with her, but she was just enjoyable to watch because she was, really good at Kung Fu and beating people up and just like murdering people. I was like, I didn't know she was going to murder him. Like, it was just, I didn't know what she was going to do. And she could do anything. And I would believe it because she was that wild. And that was fun. Like when she wanted to fight the two heroes on one and told her henchmen to back off, I was like, yeah, I believe it. She's crazy. She'd do it. So, that we could get into, oh, well, she's got some expertise. And so we like people that are good at things, and stuff like that. So there was a reason that she was enjoyable to watch. But I think part of it too was that it was different than the norm, but that's just the cycle with everything, right? We get something that becomes used so much, it becomes a trope, and then an anti-trope comes into being, and then the anti-trope becomes a big thing, and then people get sick of the anti-trope, and they're like, I miss the old trope. People are just like, just give me a farm boy or farm person who wants to be great someday, right? Like, I don't need the bitter mercenary who hates their life and is really, a diamond in the rough. Just give me a young person that wants to succeed, right? And that's just, it feels like the never-ending cycle, which is interesting. I know we've moved sort of away from just antagonists, but I think it is interesting to talk about those cycles and how they relate to these antagonist or villain as characters. Does anyone have any final thoughts about something they really like writing, or something they feel is a good example that someone who is writing could look at? Anything like that?
Yeah, just kind of super quick to go off of what you mentioned, Jeff, because you talked about this particular villainess who was really dislikable, but also like really, really capable, right? Which made me think of Brandon Sanderson's 3 sliders of character, which some people ascribe to, some people do not. If you have not heard of this, please feel free to look it up. But basically the general assertion is that competence, proactivity, and likability are kind of the 3 sliders for your characters. And if your character is not very likable, then by making them more competent or more proactive, you can make them a more interesting character and things like that. I think that applies just as well to protagonists as it does to villains, but I do think it's really important with villains because I think a lot of people believe that they have to make their villains extremely likable kind of currently. And I think it is possible to not do that and still make them an interesting character.
Yeah, just going off Mason's comment. Oh, sorry, Cameron, you can go ahead.
Good, go ahead.
Just going off Mason's comment real quick, I think the beauty of villains is you don't have to like them. And I think that's why they're so popular, why people love villains that you love to hate, because a protagonist is supposed to be likable. So if they do something wrong, you lose that allegiance to that character real quick, but you're just free from that burden of needing to side with them. So no matter what they do, it's just fun. It's just a rollicking good time. Yay, villains, because I don't have to like you.
I think whether you're leaning into the trope or the anti-trope or going a new direction entirely, at the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter so long as it's an interesting character. Because anybody who's ever been in theater knows the most fun characters to play are the villains, because there's an element not just in theater but also in literature of voyeurism, of experiencing something you'll never get to experience yourself. This is why we all love fantasy and sci-fi, because you get to live lives and go to places you can't. And part of the emotional arc of a book is going to emotional places that you can't or won't or haven't. And some of the fun of that, some of the most fun in a well-written book, is going to the dark places and seeing the evil deeds done by someone who, whether redeemable or not, is painted in an interesting enough light so that you can really dig your teeth into it. I'm mixing metaphors, I think, but the idea, it doesn't matter what you do so long as you do it interestingly, right?
I think the most compelling antagonist versus villain stories that that are in my recent memory, at least because I read them in the last couple of months. There's two of them, and both of them, I love them not because they deal with the wheel of trope versus anti-trope, but they break the wheel entirely. They go in a completely new direction because the not necessarily like there's mystery involved, but like the engagement and the interestingness of these antagonists is not whether they're a sympathetic antagonist or whether we like them or not. It's the fact that we didn't realize they are an antagonist at all. So the two that I'm thinking of, and these are like light spoilers with no specifics, I'm just kind of explaining how their arc works. The first was N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy with the 5th season and such, because we find out in the 3rd book that there is an antagonist for everything that's been happening for 3 books. And we realize that all the characters have been referring to this antagonist as if they were an obstacle. Like, the reader was not led to believe that this antagonist was actively taking any action. They were just kind of in the way, causing trouble. And then by the 3rd book, we realized, oh no, this is an actual being trying to stop us. What do we do? But the far more interesting one is one that I actually just encountered last night. It was, I'm reading through Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota sequence, specifically the 4th and final book. And all through the whole series, it's been very clear that there are no antagonists. Like, this is hard speculative fiction where the interestingness is exploring what people do in the situations that she's created. And there really are no protagonists or antagonists. There's just people making decisions, and you have to decide whether you agree with them or not. And then in book 4, that rug is entirely pulled out. And suddenly it's not about choosing who you root for, it's about choosing who your antagonist is. Because in the 4th book, Ada Palmer has several different characters of several different factions doing absolutely horrific, monstrous things. And you have to decide which one you think is justified and which one you think is being an obstacle to your goals. And this was kind of shocking for me, because last night I was reading this and I just went, oh my gosh, this character who I've followed for 4 books, who I've seen inside their mind, see their motivations, I understand why they're doing what they do, and they are evil to me. Like, what they're doing is actively like pushing against the goals that I want for how I want this book to end. And I realized that I didn't realize this. I learned this from the author herself, that this is entirely intentional, because I asked her about I asked her on Twitter about specific passages in the book where it seemed like people were having vastly different opinions about what was going on. I asked her, am I interpreting this wrong? Did you want us to think something different? And she did reply to me, and she said, this is specifically to show that people disagree on this issue, and I want to show all sides and then have every reader decide for themselves. And that was just the most brilliant way to deliver an antagonist that I had seen in recent memory, was to present all sides in the first 3 books, and the 4th books go, okay, now you have to decide who the antagonist is. You understand all these people's motivations. You understand that they're all making bad decisions, but who do you root for after seeing how horrible everyone is being? And it was just kind of an eye opener. It was by far the most original take on antagonism I'd ever seen.
That sounds interesting, but also terrible. Like I would just hate everybody. Like I hate all you people, not you're choosing the right choices. But I hear what you're saying, Jonah, that does, it gives sort of that reader the choice of there wasn't someone propped up initially of like, here's the villain, here's the hero to defeat them. You're more deciding, like you say, who you're gonna vote for, vote in your mind. Is that, I mean, I think George R. R. Martin pushes a little bit in terms of like Jon, Snow basically being the hero, but I feel like we do get to see the reasoning behind like, Cersei Lannister and other groups where you could maybe be like, I'm in the Lannister camp or something, maybe. So I feel like that plays a little bit with that, but it doesn't sound to do it as specifically or purposefully as perhaps the one you're talking about, which is cool. I have one last quick thing I'd like to talk about, but if anyone else has something else, since I just said some stuff, please feel free.
One last thought on what you and Jonah were just saying. It depends on what kind of reader you want, right? Like you've got some readers who really do not want to put in the effort to say, these are all viable options, which one do I believe in? They don't want to put that much effort into their book, and that doesn't mean they're bad readers. They are readers who would prefer a little less work, right? Jonah's not one of those readers. He likes to dig into that, right? And have that ambiguity and be forced to grapple with it. And so know what you're going for, I think is.
Yeah, and that's why I think it works so well as book 4. Because if I were being faced with a standalone novel where I had one book to get to know all these people well enough to make that kind of decision, I would probably have balked. I probably would have gone, well, I mean, we're following this viewpoint, so obviously I agree with them. But having 3 previous books to go, okay, we're going to learn everything we possibly can about these people, and then you're going to have to choose. That's real. I think what really made it work for me, and also the fact that I do agree that these books, they definitely pull in people who have strong opinions about philosophy and politics and such, as opposed to people who just kind of agree that there are all sides and try to agree with all of them on what they think are right. So it makes sense that I would be pulled in more than many other readers.
One last quick type, just want to mention that I personally really like is the rival. You see it a lot in anime. Since we're talking about writing a book series, it has it, and there can be plenty of things said about the series. So I'm not saying people have to like the series, but in the Demon Cycle series, you've got a character and a rival that continually are sort of bumping heads throughout the arc of the 5-book series, and they grow because of the way that they're rivals. And that's something that I really like, and there's so many examples of it in anime. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, you got Naruto and Sasuke. You've got, in more recent terms with My Hero Academia, you've got Midoriya and Bakugo. You've got even something, my favorite, Berserk, you've got Guts and Griffiths. So, there's many examples of this in anime, and it's something that I've tried to do some in my newest book that's, I just finished up the first book for mostly. But it's something that I think is really fun to have because, as Cameron was talking about, it doesn't have to be a bad person. The rival does not need to be an enemy. They don't need to be a villain. They could be just someone who's part of your group, and you're both sort of like trying to beat the other person. It could even be your best friend initially that is your rival that you're trying to beat. And so it becomes this very sort of closely tied to you antagonist. And then you can take that different places. You can take it into, maybe there is a separation, and then they do become enemies more, where one is a hero and one is a villain, and maybe you're even having to pick which one is the hero and which one is the villain, which one you believe in more. And so I think those type of stories are very fun to me because I feel like we can have rivals, obviously, in our day-to-day lives that are our friends, where we compete on smaller things initially. So it feels like it hits very close to home for me personally, but puts it on a grander scale, which is, I think, if I was to quickly try to psychoanalyze why I like it as a form of antagonist, that would be it.
I will only accept rivals to lovers. That is the only acceptable option.
All right. Well, I think that was us for antagonists, obstacles, villains, different ways, of course, these elements can be used in your story to drive conflict, which of course creates interesting stories, ideally. Any last shouting or anything else before we say goodbye? All right, I think we were good. Well, keep up the writing, everybody. This was up. This was us at the Writer's Block. And we'll catch you all next time, Blockheads.